Good morning. I'm Michael Green, the clerk of Green's List at the Bar. Thanks very much for getting up early and coming in. Kath has said any questions you wish to ask, please ask at any time. We won't set aside a time at the end. Just put your hand up and ask, or during the break, whenever you'd like to, so as informal as possible. Just a little bit about Kath. There is a screed there in the pack. Kath's a registered psychologist, and that's what she brings to this topic this morning of emotional intelligence, is her experience and learning as a psychologist. She has her own coaching and consulting business, and among her clients, in fact, is our list. We use Kath as a business development consultant to our barristers. She also works with the Vic Bar in a similar area, and one of her other clients is the Public Transport Victoria. What may be of more interest to you and maybe more credibility for Kath is she is actually, I was going to say one of us, although I've been one of us for 20 years. She's a lawyer by training and has been a lawyer for most of her professional life. She was a partner with Wisewell Marnie's litigation there. She was also a manager at the Victorian Workcover Authority in there, helping manage litigation of the biggest litigator in the state. But a couple of years ago she saw the light and decided to give up the law and use her psychology as to work in that area and conduct a business. So please welcome Kath McCarthy.
Thanks, Michael. I was talking to one of the barristers I'm working with about presenting today. So I'm talking on emotional intelligence. He said, well, you'll be starting that with a group hug, won't you? So, no, I'm joking. You don't really have to. Who has never heard the term emotional intelligence before? Okay, that's good. Often people it's been rattling around for a long time, since the mid-80s, and so I'm always cautious that there's a lot of learning that's been brought to the topic that I sort of have to fit into and see if there's shifts that need to be done. So if you haven't, great. I'll be filling in all the big blanks, and if you have, I might be addressing some of the assumptions or preconceptions that you bring to the room today. What I want to do with today's talk is to break open what emotional intelligence is, so to give you a reasonably thorough understanding of a very robust model of EQ, which is a short for emotional intelligence. That comes from the concept of emotional quotient. And more importantly, to demonstrate to you how useful it can be in your practices as lawyers, so that it's not just a concept that exists in the minds of consultants, although it certainly does, but to see how it can make you better lawyers when you leave here today. I spend a lot of time helping lawyers shape their practices, mostly barristers, but to look at the practices they have and help them work towards the practices they want to have. This process certainly involves legal skills, but it also involves competence in many of the things I'm going to be covering today. My postgrad training was in EdPsych, educational psychology, so I spent a lot of time working with intellectual intelligence, IQ, doing tests on both ends of the IQ spectrum, so that an average IQ is about 100, and a gifted person is 130 plus. It's about 5% of the population. I came to the world of emotional intelligence with a lot of scepticism. I thought it was a lot of BS because there was robust measures of IQ and it had been around for a very long time, and EQ didn't have, at that point in the mid-90s, measures that were as robust as the measures for IQ. As I have moved through life and as my career in law developed, I began to appreciate that there is a real difference between knowledge and wisdom. And I also began to appreciate that when you're in a room of IQ equals, what I mean by that is a person sitting next to you, if you're typical of the lawyer's population, you would have an average, above average, or possibly highly above average IQs. So if you were in a world of people who are all smart, how do you distinguish yourself? And I saw over and over again examples of where people succeeded in law. It wasn't only about their IQ. There was something else going on. So I moved from being an EQ, emotional intelligence skeptic, to something else, much more open to the idea. So what is it? It's a basic definition of what emotional intelligence is. And in short, it's the ability to manage yourself and your emotional life, and the ability to manage the emotional life of others. So how to manage your own emotions and to manage the emotional life of others. Why should you care? Okay, this is a really big question. Why should you care? IQ is recognised as an important element of success, and particularly in law. IQ has a strong association with academic achievement. Typically, high IQ people do well at school, not surprising, but typically, not always, but typically. They are associated with earning a lot more money over the span of a lifetime. These are studies upon studies over decades of research. They tend to also be healthier. So IQ seems to be pretty important. Today, IQ is recognised as not the only determinant of success. It's part of it, but not only about success. To give you a smattering of some of the studies that have recently been done in terms of the importance of emotional intelligence. There was a US insurance firm that looked at their insurance salesmen last year and measured some aspects of emotional intelligence, measured things like confidence, self-confidence, initiative, and empathy. There's some aspects of emotional intelligence. And they found that people who were low in that got an average premium in their sales of $54,000, which is pretty good, so happy with that. People who were high in those three domains got an average policy, premiums in their policies of $114,000, and it was the only distinguishing feature were those three. Another one in Carnegie Mellon, which, as you've probably heard of, is a pretty high status US university, looked at what percentage of their engineer graduates succeeded and what were the factors that could lead to their success. And this is another example of a group of very highly intelligent and capable people. And they found that 85% of success was due to human engineering. It's an engineering faculty, so they had to find some other way of calling it, human engineering, which was a measure of personality, ability to communicate, negotiate and lead. 15% was due to technical knowledge and smarts. There was a Nobel Prize-winning Israeli-American psychologist who found that people would rather do business, and this is important for lawyers, people would rather do business with people they like and trust than people they don't. I think we've probably experienced that. Those clients you have a good emotional relationship with, they stick with you, they're loyal to you. It's where you distinguish yourself from others who might be able to offer the same legal services. So I think many lawyers live that research in their daily lives. So in short, it seems that you will need a baseline IQ. It's important in success in law, but that it's necessary but not sufficient in order to succeed in every aspect. Necessary but not sufficient. Really interesting book called The Millionaire's Mind. This is in the world of pop psychology. I'll try not to take you into that realm, but it's a good book. I like Millionaires. So they found that they asked millionaires across America, I think there was a lot, like 700 millionaires, what were the factors of their success? So I just asked them to list that. It's hard to get millionaires' time. So what were the top 5 factors? And these were the factors. IQ was rated as the 21st factor, and all the others up there, not all about emotional intelligence, but it was up there in the top 5 factors. And if you took out lawyers, it was even lower. So lawyers did rate their IQ in a higher way than other millionaires. So street smarts is your ability to tune into the world. What you learn in law is school smarts. What you learn in life is street smarts, and both are important. Okay. Where did it come from? I think EQ is a child of the 80s, but it dates back to a lot earlier than that. The scientific study of emotion, so where scientists took it seriously rather than just philosophers and people in the world of religion, the scientific study of emotions probably can be dated back to at least as early as Darwin, who was looking at the emotional display in animals and its interaction with evolution. So it was beginning to be taken seriously and have some scientific basis to it, interest. Sort of disappeared from the world of science until psychology started revving up in the early 1900s, and the word intelligence and linking with the word or concepts around emotion was as early as 1920 when he talked about social intelligence. Thorndike was one of the fathers of modern psychology. Then it disappeared until this guy, who has a very cheesy grin, doesn't he? You wouldn't trust him as a psych. But he's very famous, Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis is the father of CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy. He came along and found that there was a link between thinking and emotions and behaviour. And if you intervene at the level of thoughts, you can change the emotional experience of someone and therefore their behaviour. And this was somewhat of a revolution, so that people are no longer just victims of their emotional life. They can intervene and have an impact on it in a cognitive way. And it resulted in an explosion of studies into the area until we get to the 80s. And the 80s is when there was a lot of academic interest in emotional intelligence, where people were beginning to be interested in positive psychology and why do people succeed when there's all the evidence to suggest they won't. That was the world of positive psychology. When everything happens in their life that goes wrong, why do they thrive? It led to positive psych. In the same way, why do people with high IQ fail? And that led to the world of emotional intelligence. It started with Howard Gardner's work in 83, and you heard of multiple intelligences, where IQ was broken out into psychomotor skills and social skills, and a whole lot of other intelligences were given currency with a lot of scepticism, but it had a big impact on the world of education. If you were going through education in the 1980s, your teachers would have been informed by this. Then along came Goleman, who wrote a book, which you may have read, called Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. This was a pop psychology book, but it had a major impact in the corporate world. And suddenly every consultant was on board with the world of emotional intelligence, which was great because it took it out of what was happening in the academic world into mainstream. But it was a problem because it's where the whole concept of EQ, if you've come into the room with some understanding of it, got muddied a lot. A lot of anecdotal stories became sold as scientific, robust facts, and that's just not the case. So in some ways it broke open the concept of EQ. In others, it did it a great disservice. What I want to do today is present two models, the two basic models that have the scientific backing, that have testing associated with it, that have been around since the early 1980s, and it developed and developed and developed, so that if you can understand the models, you can have some confidence that the concepts I'm presenting today are traced back to academic research rather than the pop psychology world that has polluted the area. The first one is this one, the mesquite. This is a measure of it, which is a model based on potential, that people it's used for testing for people to come into an organisation, and where people say, what's the potential of this person to be a really great leader or a great manager? What's their emotional potential? And that's where that definition came from that I showed you earlier, where emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive emotions, access, generate emotions to assist thought, understand emotions and regulate them. And it was a model based on ability. It's not the model I'm going to present and spend time with today, because I think it's ultimately somewhat disempowering and impractical, because you're told what your ability is. Well, what do you do with that? What can you do to intervene and improve it? And that's really what is useful to you. If you can find techniques to improve your emotional intelligence, that's useful. So this is the second one. This is what we're going to be spending time on today. This is based on the Baran model of emotional intelligence. They sit side by side. They just measure different things. What this model looks at are what are the competencies, what are the skills associated with being high in emotional intelligence? What are the things you can do and the areas that you need to concentrate on in order to improve your capacity to intervene and interact the world in an emotionally competent and responsible way? The Baran model has 5 areas of competence, and within each one are 15 skills. They're depicted in this diagram, and if you knew emotional intelligence or you interact with it for long, you'll run across this picture at some point. Basically, it says the 5 areas of competence are self-perception, so know thyself, how well do you know yourself, and how you motivate yourself, and that has 3 skills associated with it. So emotional self-awareness, self-regard, self-actualization. I will unpack all these for you in a minute. The self-expression one, which is orange, this is how you face the world. How do you come across to other people? How do you manage and express your emotions? This looks at emotional expression, how independent you are, how assertive you can be. The interpersonal domain, or a yellowy colour, excuse me. These are your people skills, really. How well are you able to form relationships and interact with others so as to form mutually satisfying relationships? So this looks at interpersonal skills, your capacity to express and experience empathy, and your social responsibility. Then there's a decision-making realm, which is really looking at the overlap between your rational skills, which you will have developed as lawyers, your logic, and the way you bring those skills to your emotional life. Impulse control, reality testing, and problem solving. This would be an area which you'd be familiar with, but maybe not applied to your emotional life. And stress management. It's really looking at resilience. It's the final domain. Okay, now this is kind of a content-heavy workshop, and while I am extraordinarily engaging as a speaker, I have the emotional intelligence to know that I won't be able to hold your attention for the whole time. So what I want to do, the way we're going to structure this, while there is a break at about 8 o'clock, there's going to be 2 other breaks where I'm going to ask you to connect with the material so that it makes sense to you. Because otherwise it'll just be a lot of talking to me and you'll start thinking about your practices, what you've got on at 9 o'clock. So there's going to be 2 micro breaks where you work with the person next to you. Have a chat to them, 3 minutes. What I want you to do is introduce yourself if you don't already know the person next to you, and have a little break to have a chat about one or all or any question you have to see how is this sitting with you as a concept. 3 minutes will go very quickly. So say hello to the person next to you, practice some of your emotional intelligence skills, and I'll call you back to order in about 3 minutes. Now, in your packs, you have a sheet here, a rating scale. As I go through the model, what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about yourself or someone else that you would like to reflect on their emotional intelligence. It could be a partner, it could be someone at your work, it could be a client, someone you know well. And as I go through each of the domains, give them a bit of a score, give yourself a bit of a score as to how you think you would judge them on each of these scales. You would find that people generally will have some strengths. Even the most emotionally unintelligent people you would judge as most will have some strengths in one or more of these domains, and everyone will have development needs. So, as I go through it, just another way for you to connect with the content and bring it home for you. Rate yourself or somebody else. Right. Let's start with self-perception. As I said, the self-perception realm is a realm which is measuring how in touch with your feelings you are, how good you feel about yourself, and how in touch with other people's feelings you are. Self-perception. That's the definition. I'll let you read the low and the high. So people who are low in this as a measure of the 3 skills would generally present in the way up there on the board, and people who are high in this present up there. You'll find I won't read the slides. Okay, so emotional self-awareness is one of the 3 skills that are made fit under this realm. Emotional self-awareness is the ability to recognise your feelings and differentiate between them, and recognise how your feelings are impacting on others. This self-awareness piece is a building block of EQ. If you don't know what's going on, you can't intervene to change it. So if you're not aware of what's happening at an emotional level, it's very difficult for you to have control over it. We have ouch points. You know, some people can prod us or say something to us that triggers a reaction. If you're not aware of what those ouch points are and don't have the emotional self-awareness for that, then it's very difficult to manage your reactions. You're always in a reactive space rather than a responsive state. So you're reacting a lot more. If you haven't had any exposure to mindfulness practices, this would be tapping into the observing self. So if that's something where you're watching what's happening to you at an emotional level. An advantage of being high in this skill is that 1, you will have more control. 2, you won't be as surprised by your emotional reactions, you won't be overtaken by them as much. And 3, you'll be spotting the potential blind spots in yourself. Because most of the time, other people are aware what your ouch points are, but you might not be. So let's take a case of Peter, who was handed a file from another solicitor in his office, and it was an absolute dog's breakfast. I don't know whether this had happened to you. There's a trial on in a week, and he has a big practice of his own, and things weren't exchanged, and not all the material's there, and the person who was briefed was not up to it, and the brief wasn't done. He is stressed, he's irritated, he's also aware that he's challenged by what's before him. He's conscious that there's a relationship and that he has an affection for the solicitor who's gone off on leave and wants to support them. And all this is being processed by him, and he's aware of it all. The same thing happens to Jenny, who is just angry and goes and has a beer at the pub. Who can't see the nuances between the various emotional reactions to what's happened. Peter would manage that situation better than Jenny. Would just have more choices about how to respond and manage that. So that's emotional self-awareness. Self-regard, this is the ability, or the competence around respecting and accepting yourself the way you are. So it's not self-esteem, it's not liking yourself, no matter what, though it's close to that. The self-esteem movement that a lot of parents were told was important in generating their children has largely been discredited, that not everyone is special all the time, despite what the Lego movie is saying at the moment. Everything isn't always awesome. Sometimes we fail, and that's okay. We have limitations, and that's okay. You don't have to be good at everything. What this taps into is your capacity to see yourself warts and all, and basically like yourself warts and all. So it's to not necessarily feel good about yourself, but to acknowledge strengths and weaknesses and move forward with them, to accept them. Someone who is high in this doesn't have to invest so much energy in hoping people don't notice that they are inadequate, They don't have so much imposter syndrome where they're worried about getting caught out. I've worked with someone who was high in this regard. So Sally, not her name, had a slump in her work, and from a client who she used to get a lot of work from, and she interpreted this as rejection, and at a personal level, really rejection, and it threw her into, sorry when I say low on this, threw her into a spiral of self-doubt, and she really turned in on herself. That because this client wasn't giving her work, that she became very concerned about how good she was a solicitor. Jen, who was high on this, saw that this could have been something to do with the client's business or something else. She knew she was a good solicitor. She knew she was a pretty competent person and she'd done a good job. So instead of going into a spiral of self-doubt based on the rejection she experienced, she used her time productively to go and do business development. So was able to cope a lot more effectively because she could fall back onto that basic self-regard that she had about her strengths and weaknesses. So it can help you. Self-actualization is a concept that overlaps with the work of Abraham Maslow, if you've heard of that, which is looking at motivation, of how you meet your needs. This is tapping into the ability to realise your potential. So I like to think of it more as tapping into your passion, knowing what you're passionate about and pursuing it. Probably a way to think about this. Knowing what really, truly, intrinsically motivates you and aligning your efforts with that motivation. Knowing the difference between, knowing how to map a pathway between your skills and your strengths, so that you don't fall into stress because you're challenged too much, or you don't fall into boredom because you're not given sufficient challenge. So it's a world of flow, if you've seen any of that work. People who are high in self-actualisation would tend to set goals that are action-oriented. So we know from the goal-setting theory and work that if you set action-based goals rather than outcome-based goals, that you're more likely to achieve them. So goals about the process. People who are high in this would tend to pursue things that are about continual learning, and they put in discretionary effort. So let me give you an example. Let's say Matthew. He had a great love of law. So when he came to the law, he was pursuing a fascination with it, and he loves rolling around in cases. He was someone in law school who read every case, not just the head notes. Not me. He loves a complex piece of advice work, and he will lose himself in that work and emerge later and just feel energised by it. So he's passionate about the law and the role he's playing in the law. And so he reads extra cases that probably his client never requires him to. He's got a 10-year plan. He knows what kind of practice he wants and he pursues it. He engages in a lot of discretionary effort in terms of going the extra mile, and it's easy for him. Think of that compared to someone else, say Jodie, who doesn't think much about her practice. She did law because she got good marks. She enjoys it. She finds it stressful sometimes, but there's other things going on in her life. Law is a means to an end. It's a good career to be part of, and it's something she doesn't think a lot about. If you look at the two of them, how likely are they to be pushing themselves? Which one is likely to be more motivated in their legal practice? So you can see how developing skills in this area, in terms of self-actualisation, can assist you motivate and hang in there and persist as a lawyer, if you can find ways to tap into your passion or align your legal practice with your passion. Okay. Self-expression is a realm of EI, emotional intelligence, that concerns how in touch with your feelings you are. Being able to openly and honestly express your feelings and your thoughts enables you to have better relationships. I think this is the way it works in terms of increasing your life competence. These are, if you're high in this domain and low in it, this is what you would generally see. Okay. 3 components of this. One is emotional expression, the ability to openly express feelings both verbally and non-verbally. This is like holding a mirror up to yourself, and do you know how you're coming across? Do you know how you're being perceived by others? Is there congruence between what you feel and how you present? Can you communicate what you mean to accurately so that what you mean to say is actually understood by the person you're speaking to, whether it's through your thoughts or whether about your thoughts or about your emotional life? An example of the presence of this, people who can raise an eyebrow and say a million words just at the right time. Thunderous silence that is more powerful than any spoken word, where there's real congruence between what is said and what is communicated. People who are high in this often have a really broad vocabulary about their emotions. You can notice a difference and name it very accurately. Examples of this, you will have come across people who aren't good at this. There's often stiltedness and awkwardness. I've negotiated with some barristers sometimes who smile inappropriately. It just makes you feel a bit uncomfortable. You smile at the wrong time when they're really having a go at you. Some people seem very stiff and you just don't want to spend a lot of time with them. Sometimes it's about emotional expression. It's just not that congruence. And it's very hard to build trust with people who are low in emotional expression, where there seems to be a lack of transparency between what is being felt and what's being communicated. Something's a bit off if it's low in this. People who are strong in this can build trust much more effectively because they've got a lot of control over how they're coming across. And if you think you're in the business of building or selling legal services, I think lawyers are in the business of selling trust. So it's a very important part of developing your skills as a lawyer. Independence is the ability to be self-directed and self-controlled in your thinking and action, so free of emotional dependencies, standing on your own 2 feet. As you rise through law, you need to be able to exercise independent thought. You can't rely on other people when you're in front of a client and giving advice. You have to back yourself. If you're low on independence as a measure of emotional intelligence, this would be a stressful experience for you. People who are low on this would be trying to look for support, particularly in times of stress. If you're high on independence, you should be able to interact with people without the need for reinsurance and that feedback loop. You can back yourself a lot more easily. Assertiveness is a concept many people are familiar with. It's not aggression. It's not being nice. It is recognising what you feel and think, having sufficient impulse control not to express it, having enough vocabulary to find the words to accurately convey what you mean, and backing yourself enough to think it's worth putting yourself out there. So assertiveness is finding a way to express yourself in a constructive and accurate manner and doing it. Some people think assertiveness is much more similar to aggression, and it really isn't. So I think that's a good time for a break.